everyone, and welcome to a new format of video. I'm not even sure what I'm going to call this, but it's a hybrid between a progress vlog and a making a video. I filmed quite a bit of the sewing process, but I didn't film every step, and I filmed quite a bit of vlog type footage where I just talk about my thoughts on the project and what I'm going to do next. Hopefully I can cobble the footage together into something that's interesting and you'll enjoy watching. In this video I'm making a grand pannier, and I followed a pattern from Simplicity. Well, followed might be kind of an overstatement, but I did use the pattern and follow some of the instructions. And on that note, I'm going to get right into the footage. Let's start off with the materials I'm going to be using. The pattern I'm following is from Simplicity's premium print-on-demand service, and I will leave a link to the pattern I'm using down below as well as the pattern number. I'm also going to be using 5 yards of this bright pink cotton broadcloth, some matching thread, some hooping wire that's 1/4 of an inch thick, not a 1/2 inch because a 1/2 inch was more expensive, and I didn't want to pay that much money. I also have some boning connectors, some satin ribbon, and some twill tape to house the boning. If you're interested in any of these things, they will all be linked down below, or I will have it listed where I purchased them. Now I'm going to go ahead and take the pattern out of its box and cut out the pieces that I need so I can start to figure out how this is going to go together. I think I managed to find all the pieces for the panniers. As far as I can tell, there are only 3 pieces, but they get cut out multiple times. Hopefully that's right and I'm not missing one. And I've managed to fit all the ones I'm not using back in the box, which I'm very proud of. The pattern pieces themselves don't look too intimidating. The instructions are a little bit scary, but I think that's mostly because I don't usually follow instructions, I usually make them up. So I find the wording that they tend to use quite confusing. But hopefully I'll be able to figure it out, and I'll take you guys along with me as I attempt to. So I did that a little bit differently than they requested. Instead of laying my fabric out and folding it in half and then cutting each pattern piece out twice, I folded my fabric so it was 4 layers thick and then cut each piece out once, except it was 4 layers thick instead of 2. So that just ended up being faster for me, though I don't know if I'd recommend it because it is kind of hard on your wrist and your scissors cutting through that many layers of fabric. I'm also proud of myself because I paid attention to the grain line, and I remembered to cut all these little notchy things. I don't know if you can see them. I don't notch my own patterns, and I use self-drafted patterns 95% of the time, so it feels very weird to have to do that. Next instructions tell me to press under hem allowance on long side edge of gusset. To form narrow hem, tuck under raw edge to meet crease, press. Stitch hem in place. And I feel like I would get the same result if I just folded that edge in by 1/4 inch twice, and it'll be a little bit less fiddly. So I think that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do a little sampler of doing flat felled seams because some of the other steps require that and I haven't done it in quite a while. So I just want to make sure that I remember how before moving forward, and then I'll update you guys again. Okay, wait a sec. It said to hem the long edge of the gusset, but the long edge of the gusset is also supposed to be sewn as a flat felled seam to this panel. That doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, so I think I'm just not going to do it, and instead I'm going to sew this as a flat felled seam and then move forward with the rest of their instructions. Alright, so I sewed all the pieces together with 5/8 of an inch seam allowances, which is what this pattern called for, and now it's time to turn them into flat felled seams, and I really hate doing these. I just looked up a tutorial just to refresh my memory, and I do know how to do them. I just don't like doing them, so I'm going to show you my little hack for doing it, which I think is easier. But I will leave that tutorial down below in case you want to learn how to do it properly. So instead of ironing the seams to one side, I'm going to iron the seam open. Now just cut this top seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch, and you should use a ruler for this. I'm obviously going to be using a ruler off screen and not freehanding it. Then I'm going to fold this edge inward so it touches the line of stitching. Then just tuck that over top of the edge that you cut and iron it in place. And now it's just time to repeat that 3 times. So I just finished pinning all the seams and that was pretty painful. If I made this pattern again, I would definitely up the seam allowance to 3/4 of an inch. Found that the little notches extended past the halfway point of the seam allowance, which meant there were little raw edges sticking out there even after folding them. Anyway, now I'm going to go ahead and sew across the folded edge, which will complete the seam, and then I'm going to iron all of the pieces. I just realized that the first step when they told me to hem the long edge of the gusset, they meant this edge. So I'm a little late in figuring that out, but I'm going to do it anyway. I went ahead and sewed the front seam and the back seam as a 3/4 inch seam, which gave me way more room to do the flat felled seams, and I'm a lot happier with how they look. Also, for the front panel, as you can tell, I left the top couple inches open as the pattern mentioned in the instructions, and this is how you get it on and off. This sits at the center front. So I'm going to do the top stitching, then mark the boning channels, and then sew these side panels on, and it should start to take shape shortly thereafter, which I'm pretty excited about. I apologize for the backdrop. This no longer fits on the floor of my sewing room, so I've moved out to the hall. But I've made some progress and I kind of forgot to film, but I'll tell you what I did. I laid my fabric over top of the pattern, and luckily the fabric was thin enough that I could just trace the boning channel pattern directly onto the material. It was great and it didn't take very long at all. Then I sewed the side panels on with 5/8 of an inch seam allowances, and then I just sewed the seam allowance down. I didn't flat fell the seams. I didn't do anything fancy. I figured this fabric isn't very prone to fraying, so it's going to be fine. And then I repeated this process on the front panel as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and do up the side seams, and then I can hem it and start sewing the boning channels on. It's been a couple hours and now I'm back to work. I'm just turning the hem inward by 1/2 inch, and then I'm pinning some of the twill tape over top of it so it sits about 1/8 of an inch away from the hem. And the pattern doesn't actually call for a boning channel here, but I think it's going to really help get the shape that I want. I know American Duchess followed this pattern and added a bone to the hem and it looked awesome, so I'm hoping I will have similar results. And I think since I'm tall, it's just going to be important to have more support near the hem of the skirt. So that's what I'm doing, and then I'm just going to sew this boning channel on. I might actually pin a couple of the boning channels and then do a few at once. Just sort of depends on how I'm feeling. I got all the boning channels on, and that's going to be it from me today, but I will pick this project back up tomorrow, get the waistline bound, and hopefully get all the boning in and get this project finished. However, I am a little bit worried about boning because, as you might be able to tell, I ran out of twill tape when I was doing the boning channels, so instead I had to use ribbon. And I purchased 12 yards of twill tape, and I only have 10 yards of boning. So if I ran out of twill tape, then I definitely don't have enough boning. I kind of predicted this happening because I knew I was going to be adding a bone to the hemline, which will take up quite a bit of boning, but I thought it would take up 3 yards, not 4.5, which is the actual circumference of the hem. So I'm going to have to mix and match and potentially use regular spring steel in one of these channels, which would suck, but I don't really have another option. So I'm going to play around with it tomorrow and keep my fingers crossed, and hopefully it'll still be functional and still look really good and have an awesome silhouette, even with swapping out some of the materials. Oh, and before I forget, I want to mention that I used twill tape and ribbon on this because they don't stretch. And the pattern actually calls for you to use bias tape to create the channels, but bias tape, since it's cut on the material's bias, can warp and stretch, which is awesome if you're going around curves and trying to bind tricky edges. But when you're making a boning casing, the boning can actually warp the bias tape over time, which can change the shape of the garment. So I'd highly suggest using twill tape or ribbon instead. The ribbon will be thinner and the boning will be more prone to poking through than the twill tape, but ribbon tends to be cheaper. So it's a new morning, and I think I'm already off to a good start. I cut out a few strips of fabric on the remaining material's bias, and I cut these strips to be 3 inches wide, and then I folded the edges inward towards the center point. Now I'm going to sew this onto the top edge of the pannier, and it will serve as a waistband. Then I can use the ribbon to gather the waistband down to fit my waist size. So hopefully that will work well and it won't take very long to do, and hopefully it will look good too. So I finished sewing on the bias tape, and it doesn't look great, but it looks okay. That really isn't my favorite way of doing a waistband, but I understand why they did it that way for this project. And then I read the rest of the instructions and I realized I was supposed to mark dots on the front and back panels. They were on the pattern, I just totally overlooked them. So I went ahead and did that. It wasn't very difficult to do even after assembling everything. So I haven't added the boning yet, but I was reading the instructions and it talks about having ribbon going from those circular markings to shape the skirt. And I gather you're supposed to hand sew them in after the boning is in, but it seems like it'd be way easier to sew those in before you put the boning in and then tie them once it's on the dress form. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out a few pieces of ribbon and sew them onto those little black markings right above the boning channels. So I just cut out 16 pieces of ribbon that were 20 inches long. That's 10 inches shorter than they told me to make them, but I think it's going to be okay. And then I cut out a longer piece of ribbon which I'm going to use as a tie for the waist. And before sewing any of these on, I'm going to singe the edges with a flame just so they won't fray. So I meant to film myself sewing the ribbons in. In fact, I actually set up and turned the camera on while I was doing it, but I neglected to click the record button. However, it's relatively easy to explain. I just pinned the ribbon in over top of the dot I made and then backstitched over it a couple times and left a 1/2 inch tail. And that's it! And then I trimmed all the threads. I also used a safety pin to feed ribbon through the waistband I made, and now all it needs is boning. As it turns out, I actually misread the quantities of things you need for this. So you actually need 11¼ yards of boning, and that's without the bottom channel. So no wonder I don't have enough boning. So just a heads up, if you choose to make this, you'll have to get 2 spools of 10-yard hooping boning because that's the only way it's sold. And that will cost you $70 total if you choose to buy the 1/2 inch wide stuff that this pattern calls for. So that's a big investment into a foundation garment. I only purchased 1 spool because I thought I only needed 10 yards, and I purchased the 1/4 inch width, which was $25, but still pretty expensive for something that isn't going to be seen, and definitely something to consider before investing in the pattern and the other materials you'll need for this. So here's a little update. I got all the boning into the pannier, and I'm honestly really disappointed in that new replacement for hooping wire. It's not nearly as strong. It's really disappointing to pay more than twice the price of the old stuff for a product that isn't as nice. So that's kind of a bummer. After all the channels were filled and the boning was tipped, I went ahead and sewed the channels closed. Then I tied all the ribbons to the lengths that were mentioned in the instructions and tried it on. I'd say I'm happy with the shape, though I do wish it was a little bit bigger in the hips and less sloped in the sides. It's not quite the silhouette I'd hoped it would be, but it is pretty close. I haven't tried this on over a petticoat or with the proper foundation garments yet, so I'll probably have more thoughts on it after that I will share in a little wrap-up for this video. Oh, and one thing before I go, I just want to mention that the flat felled seams actually came in handy when I was adding the boning, because the boning went in nicely over top of the flat felled seams, whereas the ones that I just top stitched down, it had a habit of getting caught. So I do see the reason for doing flat felled seams on this. I would just add more seam allowance to make it a little bit easier to accomplish. And I think that's all I have to say, but I will see you guys in a little wrap-up where I share my final thoughts. Just before giving a summary and talking about my feelings on this project, I wanted to explain the whole hooping wire situation. Basically, up until a 1.5 years ago or so, hooping wire was 2 bands of wire that were encased in buckram or plastic. It was 1/2 inch wide and incredibly strong. You could bend it into a circle or a crescent, but that was about it. It just had a lot of structure to it, and it could support huge skirts without having to use a lot of it. So I was a big fan of it, and I was a big fan of the price too. I think it was between $15 and $18 for a 10 or 12 yard roll of it. So that's a lot of money, but if you think about how much you can do with that amount, it's pretty great. Now, it's been discontinued. I don't know if the factory closed down or if they just stopped producing it or what, but the replacement for it is a lot more like steel boning than it is like hooping wire. So it's a lot more flexible, a lot flimsier, it's much thinner, and it's also a lot more expensive. I think it's $25 or $35 for a 10-yard roll, and I'm just not very impressed with it. I'm not impressed with the price or the way it performs, so that's sort of a bummer. Now on to my thoughts on the Grand Pannier. I'm really pretty happy with how it turned out. Though I'm not a huge fan of the instructions because I feel like they overcomplicated things and didn't necessarily do things in an order I would recommend. I really like the pattern itself. My only complaint would be that I think there should be more room. So you can either do French seams and then sew them down, or do flat felled seams with a bit more allowance. But other than that, I think the shape is fantastic. I think everything is really clearly marked on the pattern pieces. I agree with the place of the boning channels, though I do think there should be a bone at the hemline as well. And I really agree with the ribbon placement and the length between the ribbon. I think my major issues with the finished skirt revolve around the type of boning. I find that it's quite flimsy and it doesn't hold the shape as nicely as I would like, which is definitely a quality that this new hooping wire boning replacement has, and has nothing to do with the pattern. I would rate this pattern really pretty positively. It comes together in a day or two depending on when you get started. If you're not looking to invest in this pattern, then there are patterns in Nora Waugh's corsets and crinolines, though honestly I think her book is more expensive than the pattern is. I don't think I have a whole lot else to say, so I'm just going to end this video here. As I said earlier, everything I mentioned in this video will be linked down below, so definitely check out the description box if you're interested. And thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to all of you very soon.